Thank you, Wilson. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. So first, I just want to thank the Columbia Museum of Art for this invitation to participate in the ArtBreak series. It's really nice to be live and to do something with like actual people. So thank you all for being here. Yeah, it's an honor and it's a pleasure. So when Wilson contacted me about giving a talk, in connection with Anila Quayyum Agha's work, he asked me to focus specifically on a piece called "This Is Not a Refuge," and that's the piece that's in the picture for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it. Now, this work it's accompanied by a soundscape, which you can get online, and the soundscape features the voices of dozens of immigrants and refugees who describe their experiences of coming to the United States. And it's really an amazing collection of voices. You hear about the hopes and dreams of people who come to the United States, but you also hear about the cold realities of trying to create a life in a new society, in a new country. So in my talk today, I want to expand on some of the themes that have inspired Agha's work, and especially this particular work, "This Is Not a Refuge." And these are themes as Agha describes them, and she's done a number of interviews that you can see online, including the podcast that Wilson mentioned. She describes her work as addressing belonging and displacement, outsiderness and privilege, the pain of losing one's identity, and the promise of creating something new. And as it turns out, these are themes that have been very salient in my own research. And like Agha, I've interviewed many immigrants about the experience of becoming American, and I've learned about the different ways that newcomers to the United States interpret American identity, and that they try to fit in. And in some cases, the ways that they try to rework what it means to become an American. So I think immigrants can tell us a lot about what it means to be American. And they can shed a lot of critical light on the stories that we tell about ourselves, about who we are. And again, these are stories we tell ourselves, but they're also stories that we tell others and that we tell the world. And by we here, I'm referring to established non-immigrant Americans, which I realize might leave out some people in this audience, but bear with me. So as Americans, we talk a lot about melting pots and multicultural tapestries. We talk about having forged a new nation from many nations. We talk about our nation as being exceptional and unique. There are other stories, though, that we are sometimes more reluctant to tell, certainly to ourselves, but also to others. And these are stories about exploitation and marginalization and coercion and exclusion. These are the stories of Indigenous people, the stories of enslaved Africans, and also the stories of undocumented workers who today toil in meatpacking plants and poultry plants all over the Midwest and the Southeast, and also on farms. So these myriad stories about multiculturalism and melting pots and exploitation and marginalization, they're not mutually exclusive. They're not easily pulled apart. America includes and it excludes, it accepts and it rejects. It weaves some groups and some stories into national narratives, and it leaves others out. And it does this simultaneously. So the story of immigration and nation building is really ambiguous. And this ambiguity is felt very acutely by immigrants. And I often think about immigrants as existing on the cusp of belonging. So even those who come to the United States with full legal status or with refugee protection, for them, belonging can seem partial or conditional or revocable. being an immigrant it involves a lot of insecurity. So I've learned through my research that belonging is not a passive condition. Belonging is something that's actively made. It's actively negotiated and struggled over. And the politics of belonging, it can take place in really spectacular ways. And by spectacular here, I mean there's a spectacle of belonging. So take, for example, the U.S. Mexico border, which I've got a picture of here. It's this collection of concrete slab and metal fencing and barbed wire and drones and armed border patrols. And all of this is designed to kind of form a spectacle, to show the world, to show migrants where the domestic ends and where the foreign begins. So when you hear chants of build the wall, which we've been hearing a lot the last few years, this reflects an urge to sharpen the edges of belonging, to make clearer the distinction between ourselves and others. So while the politics of belonging can often take these very spectacular forms, they can also unfold much more quietly in everyday spaces, in schools where children learn about American, quote unquote, American values and norms, in workplaces where immigrants need to make decisions about which aspects of their cultural background might be an asset that they should show and display, and which might be a liability that they should perhaps hide or submerge. And also in homes, where immigrants need to think about which habits and which customs they're going to keep and try to pass along to their children, and which ones they're going to try to ditch. So these questions about who belongs and how they come to belong, this has actually preoccupied scholars for a really long time. And I would point most famously to the sociologists of the University of Chicago in the early 1900s, who spilled a lot of ink trying to make sense of the momentous changes taking place in the United States and at the turn of the century, through immigration, but also through urbanization and industrialization. They had a major concern with this idea of assimilation, how millions of immigrants from different cultures and speaking different languages could become incorporated into America, and how America would form or kind of take shape as a coherent nation. And University of Chicago sociologists Robert Park and Ernest Burgess in 1924, and remember that date, I'm going to come back to that, they put forward what is now one of the classic definitions of assimilation, which you'll see up on the screen here. Hopefully you can read the text there. But they refer to assimilation as a process of interpenetration and fusion in which persons and groups acquire the memories, sentiments, and attitudes of other persons or groups. And by sharing in their experience and history, are incorporated with them into a common cultural life. And this definition of assimilation from 1924, it's really quite a sanguine view of social change. It's a very sort of optimistic view of assimilation. And it suggests the capacity of newcomers to acquire the social memories and traits of the group in which they've settled. And it also suggests that newcomers and established groups might fuse and be melded together to form a common life. It's important to note, though, that this kind of relatively optimistic view of assimilation, it was not universally shared in the United States at the time that they published this work. And so I think it's important to put Park and Burgess and their definition of assimilation into some historical context. So about a half century earlier, at the end of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution established birthright citizenship, right? Which means that when you're born on American soil, you're an American citizen. And so this really extended American citizenship, again, to all people born on American soil in the United States. So this was the first time with the 14th Amendment that concept kind of came to be. And the key thing with the 14th Amendment, what it was trying to do was it extended citizenship for the first time to Black Americans. So before this time, African Americans basically were not citizens of the United States for all intents and purposes. Even those who had free status were not really American citizens. A few years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the Naturalization Act of 1870 extended the right to naturalize as an American citizen to quote unquote aliens of African nativity. And that really solidified the extension of citizenship to people of African origin. So prior to this, the right to naturalize derived from the Naturalization Act of 1790. And that act in 1790 had limited naturalization to so-called free white persons. Now, the 1870 Act did not eliminate that concept, but it just added to it. So to the free white persons, it basically added persons of African nativity. So this was a really momentous shift in the way America conceived of citizenship. It signaled for the first time the inclusion of a group that had been enslaved and totally politically excluded from the body politic. But as we're well aware, equal citizenship for Black Americans was not really forthcoming. And in the decades after the Civil War, whites in the South imposed lots of different forms of white supremacy. For instance, through poll taxes, literacy tests, Jim Crow laws, and various forms of anti-Black violence. So at the same time, that Naturalization Act of 1870, it was important for another reason. So by explicitly recognizing only persons of African nativity and free white persons as eligible for citizenship, that 1870 Naturalization Act excluded all others from the right to become an American citizen. And this exclusion was very purposeful. It was aimed mainly against Chinese immigrants who had come to the Western United States during the gold rush to work in mines and on the railroads. So Chinese immigrants were very much favored by some employers, but they were also reviled for undercutting wages. They were also viewed as inherently inferior to whites and as sort of defiling white racial purity because of their supposed penchants for prostitution, gambling, and opium. So the state of California in the 1860s began to pass a number of anti-Chinese laws. The federal government then followed suit, passing its own anti-Chinese laws in the 1870s. And these culminated in 1882 with full-fledged Chinese exclusion. And later on, Chinese exclusion was expanded into the exclusion of all Asians. Now, through this whole period, in the same period, northern industrial cities were filling with European immigrants. And these European immigrants were considered white, but they were also viewed by many in the sort of more established population as racially inferior to the so-called Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Teutonic or Anglo-Nordic races. And there were deep intellectual currents in the United States at this time of white supremacy. And it's important to note that these currents were not just circulating in the South, they were everywhere in the United States. This included a very strong eugenics movement that was typified by writers like Madison Grant, who was a New York aristocrat and an ally of Teddy Roosevelt. And I'll just note very briefly here that a lot of their ideas, both of Roosevelt and Madison Grant, were foundational to the beginnings of American environmentalism and conservation movements. But that's a whole other story, which I don't have time for here. But Madison Grant wrote an influential book called Passing of the Great Race, or the Racial Basis of European History. And the book warned about the decline of the Nordic peoples in America. And this book later influenced and was much admired by Hitler. So the white supremacist and eugenicist beliefs of people like Madison Grant underpinned anti-immigrant sentiment. And again, this was not by any means marginal, or these were not fringe ideas. These kinds of ideas were part and parcel of national discourse, and they were very, very common among governing and intellectual elites in the country in the early 1900s. So these were the ideas that were behind efforts in the early 20th century to curtail European immigration. And these efforts gained momentum as the source of immigrants to the United States shifted in the early 20th century from Northern Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe, by which I mean Catholics and Jews from places like Poland and Russia and Italy. So in 1924, remember that date, the U.S. Congress passed an immigration act that imposed what were called national origins quotas. And these quotas very kind of precipitously reduced immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So to reiterate, the year was 1924. This is the same year that Park and Burgess published that work that had that definition that I mentioned of assimilation. That's when that appeared in print. So you can kind of get a sense of what Park and Burgess, in emphasizing the possibility of cultural fusion, you can get a sense of what they were pushing up against, and this very strong current of racial ideology. So the early 20th century, it was a very fraught time to be an immigrant. I think all times are fraught times to be an immigrant, but I say that was a particularly fraught time to be an immigrant. Immigration was a very salient topic in public discussion and debate. Immigration discussions occupied a lot of airtime in Congress. Now, it's important to note that not everybody was keen to curtail immigration. There were, for instance, a lot of employers, industrialists, who relied on immigrant labor, and they wanted workers. There were also liberals, like some of these Chicago school scholars, who had faith in the American melting pot, who felt that America could assimilate all of these sort of racially distinctive people and sort of create a common cultural life. But it's really the deep anxiety about racial and cultural change that ruled the day. So we might ask, a century after the passage of the national origins, almost exactly, right? Sort of in 2 years' time, it'll be the 100-year anniversary of the passage of these national origins quotas. Whether Park and Burgess were right about the interpenetration and fusion of cultures. Did America create a common cultural life in the decades after the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act? Did they manage to create a common cultural life? Well, kind of. I'd say it did for many European immigrants and their children. Some of you in this room might be the descendants the children or the grandchildren or maybe the great-grandchildren of European immigrants, and you might now think of yourselves simply as Americans. And many of us take our Americanness for granted. But I think we need to ask, how did that happen? What did the process of becoming an American look like? How did opportunities to belong to America present themselves to European immigrants? How did they present themselves differently to European immigrants than it did to Black Americans? And what's the relationship between those stories, between European immigration and European assimilation and the experiences of Black Americans in the 20th century? So we often like to tell the story of how our penniless ancestors pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and made it in America through hard work and sheer force of will. And I don't want to suggest that our ancestors didn't work hard or didn't have a lot of gumption to overcome tremendous odds. But I do want to explain here how belonging in America involved what historian Matthew Fry Jacobson has called racial alchemy. And in the context of really rampant white supremacism and very deep hostility to foreigners, becoming American required that dominant American society at some point that it crack open the door of middle-class whiteness. And then it needed to crack that door open a little bit more. And then immigrants, for their poor part, they had to figure out how to get their foot into that crack and to pry open that door a little bit wider so that they could step through. So the question is, what did that look like? So I want to draw a little bit on my own family history to provide a few clues of what that might have looked like. And many of the pictures I'm going to show you are, these are from my family's collection of old photos. And some of them look a little weird because my dad, rather than scanning them properly, just took his iPad and just photographed them on the kitchen table. And I had to sort of crop them and make them look normal. So my grandparents, they were born in the Ottoman Empire, in what's today Lebanon. And my grandfather, whom I never met, left Lebanon in 1912 when he was 13 years old. And he was accompanied by his sister and her husband. And these are pictures of him here. And they were bound not for the United States, as it turns out, but for Argentina. And they spent 2 years on a ranch in Argentina, where my grandfather, whose name was Nagel, adopted the name Julian, or Julian in Spanish. And we found that out when we got hold of the manifest to the Lusitania, which is the ship he traveled on. So he was called Julian. After 2 years in Argentina, his sister and brother-in-law decided to come to the United States, where they already had family members. So they arrived at Ellis Island in 1914, and they put my grandfather on a train to Cleveland, Ohio, to join his older brothers. And his brothers, in turn, arranged for him to attend a Catholic boarding school in, of all places, Cullman, Alabama. And here, Nagel became Kelly Nagel. And the picture on your left, that's his class in at St. Bernard's prep in Cullman, Alabama, and the school actually still exists. Now, what's interesting is that my grandfather was sent to Alabama at a time when several Southern politicians sought to label Syrians as Asians. And as I've already as I've already mentioned, being Asians was kind of the kiss of death, right? U.S. law at this time barred immigration from Asia and also barred Asians from naturalizing as American citizens. So there was really a lot at stake here for the Syrian community, as they were called at the time. So they weren't called Lebanese, they were called Syrians, in proving that they were not Asian and indeed in proving that they were white. And there were several cases between 1909 and 1915 that went before federal courts in southern states in which government lawyers sought to prove that Syrians were essentially Asian, or at least not European. And lawyers hired by the Syrian community, in turn, they sought to affirm that, that in fact the Syrian community was not Asian and that they were eligible for American citizenship. So one of the initial tactics that the Syrian community used to kind of assert their whiteness and their the fact that they were not Asian was to connect their community to Jesus, to sort of biblical Palestine, to the birthplace of Christianity. And some also kind of drew in on this history of Phoenicia. And Phoenicia is sort of, a great civilization that and the origins of the Latin alphabet. But this did not really convince the courts. Now, the judges and the lawyers in several instances arguing against the Syrians, they had commented on the swarthiness of their complexion, and they likened them to mulattoes. But judging by court transcripts and editorials that were published by members of the Syrian community, the thought of being black or mulatto was outrageous and insulting, and they would settle for nothing less than being white. Now, historian Sarah Gualtieri describes the views of one Syrian community leader this way, and I've put the quote up here. This is from Sarah Gualtieri's work. There could be no worse dishonor than for blacks to have rights that Syrians did not yet fully possess. An argument that boosted the Syrian claim to citizenship while it simultaneously called into question the appropriateness of Black and Asian citizenship. The argument in favor of Syrian whiteness in the Arabic language press became more and more about defending the Syrians' status as pure Caucasian. Now, the case of George Dow versus the United States in 1915, it was heard in the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals here in South Carolina in 1915, finally confirmed the status of Syrians as white. So I can't be certain that my grandfather knew about these cases, especially given that he was a young man. But then again, the case received a lot of attention in the Syrian community. And in any event, I'm guessing he would have learned fairly quickly, living in Alabama, the racial order of things in the South and in the United States more generally. He also likely would have been aware of the ambiguous place of the Syrian within that racial order. Now, at some point, my grandfather went back. He rejoined his family in Cleveland, and eventually he gathered enough capital to open the first of a string of bars and restaurants in Cleveland. At this point, he was called Charles Nagel, and he weathered the Depression very well. When he went back to, these are pictures from their bars and restaurants in Cleveland. And when he went back to Lebanon in the 1930s to find a wife, he did so in style. So he had done very well for himself. So my father was born in Cleveland in 1939. Both of my grandparents were Eastern Rite Catholics. My grandmother was a Melkite and my grandfather was a Maronite. But neither of my grandparents was very religious. And so my grandfather decided that it would serve his sons well in the future if they were Protestants. So he had them baptized in the Presbyterian Church. Now, they had an Irish housekeeper who was not happy about this, and she and her friend, who was an Irish steelworker, later had my father and my uncle rebaptized as Catholics. And neither of my grandparents attended the rebaptism. So my father's uncles and his older male relatives, they all fought in the Second World War. And that war, in a lot of ways, was a really important crucible of American identity formation. So fighting a common enemy, mobilizing the mass of young men in the country to fight for American freedoms and democracy and ideals, fighting against fascism. It really was a way of kind of bringing together people who had come from different ethnic origins and who were from different class statuses. But it's important to realize that as much as it was a crucible for becoming American for these young men from various immigrant backgrounds, that the military during World War II continued to segregate and to exclude Black Americans. That's my grandmother, by the way, in front of one of their restaurants. So after the war, my grandparents, like many other white people, moved away from the urban core out to the suburbs in Cleveland. And the suburbs were another important crucible of white middle-class identity. And in many ways, suburbia turned out to be the common cultural life that Park and Burgess had envisioned in 1924. So suburbanization had begun in earnest in the U.S. in the 1920s and 30s, and it almost entirely excluded Black communities, including the Black folks who came to the industrial North in search of security and opportunity after World War I. So Blacks in Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, and other northern industrial cities, they faced huge resistance and even violence when they tried to move into white neighborhoods. And it was not uncommon for me growing up to hear members of my family using racial slurs both in English and in Arabic when speaking of African Americans. I don't think there was any doubt in their minds that Blacks didn't belong in their neighborhoods and that the new suburbs were for whites like them. And the American government agreed, and Black exclusion was upheld by a sort of a legal and a quasi-legal framework of protective covenant zoning laws and state-sanctioned redlining until the late 1960s and 70s. So what I'm suggesting here is that the story of racial oppression and the story of immigrant assimilation in the U.S. have been tightly intertwined, and that belonging for the descendants of European immigrants hinged on the exclusion of Blacks. So immigrants who came in the late 19th and 20th centuries, they occupied an in-between space in American society. They had this status of being white, but not quite white. But when that door to whiteness opened wider to them, especially after World War II, they walked through that door and they made sure to shut it behind them. Now, the country has changed a lot since the mid-20th century. In 1965, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, a new Immigration and Naturalization Act was passed, and that act of 1965 repealed the 1924 national origins quotas and created racially non-discriminatory immigration policies. And some years earlier, racial restrictions on naturalization had also been repealed and lifted. So at that time, America opened itself again to mass immigration. And this time, the majority of immigrants who would come to the United States, they would come from Asia and Latin America and not from Europe. And the U.S. Welcomed, plus or give or take about 1 million legal immigrants per year from the early 1990s to 2020. So again, around 1 million legal immigrants a year. And eugenics has been widely denounced and discredited. Ideals of multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion are now very common in schools and businesses and in government, in the university. The idea that Black Lives Matter, it's still resisted by some, but it seems less revolutionary than it might have even maybe 20 years ago. Residential exclusion is breaking down, especially for Asians and Latinos, but also to African Americans. And all these point to an America that's becoming more inclusive, that's more comfortable with social and cultural differences. But there's also a lot of resistance to change. And our society, I think, tends to create new barriers while removing others. So about 20 years ago, in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, I conducted a study in which I interviewed immigrants from the Arab world to ask how they were coping with the so-called war on terror. And my research subjects described constant attacks on their beliefs and their identities and their histories. They were constantly compelled to explain themselves, to justify their cultural and religious backgrounds. And the burden was on them to assure a jittery American public that they weren't a threat. It didn't really matter or seem to matter that many of them were successful professionals or that they had been living in the country for decades. In the lead up to the 2016 elections, at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, we heard a lot of politicians, including many politicians from this state, vow to keep Syrian refugees out because these refugees might bring the threat of terrorism, because they were Muslims and because Muslims are secretly trying to bring Sharia law into the United States. And dozens of state legislatures in the last decade or so have proposed laws and state constitutional amendments to ban Sharia law, even though there's no movement among American Muslims to try to bring Sharia law or to have it recognized in the U.S. courts. Now, today, we hear anti-immigrant voices railing against Central American migrants who are fleeing violence and instability in their countries of origin. And mind you that the U.S. has had a hand in creating a lot of that instability through its interventions in Central America since the late 19th century. So we're told that these are not real refugees, that they're criminals and that they're rapists and drug traffickers. We're told that we need to build bigger walls to keep them out before they overwhelm us. And I can't help but notice the contrast in the way we talk about Syrian and Central American and Haitian refugees and immigrants, the difference between that and the way that we've been talking about the humanitarian crisis facing Ukrainians today. So why is it that we view some groups as deserving of our generosity and goodwill, and we view other groups who are facing very similar circumstances as unworthy or untrustworthy and as a threat to national integrity? So I think the sad fact is really that white supremacy runs deep in this country. The valorization of whiteness continues to inform the way that a lot of Americans see foreign others, engage the capacity of foreigners to become one of us. And that's not to say that today's immigrants and their descendants are not going to share in a common cultural life with the rest of America, and that they won't share a sense of common origin and common destiny. Many undoubtedly already feel this way. But my point here simply is that belonging doesn't happen naturally. It's not inexorable. Belonging to me is a political process, not a natural one. And when I talk about a political process, I'm not talking about elections and laws. I'm talking really about the politics of the everyday. It's about the way that all of us, consciously and unconsciously, produce and reproduce social hierarchies and social categories, the way that we favor certain groups and certain narratives over others. So immigrants, in a sense, they're kind of thrown into the middle of all of this, centuries worth of political struggles over the boundaries of nationhood. They have to figure out all these conflicting narratives. They have to kind of figure out how they can become part of this. And there's no real end point to it. It just kind of, there's constant reshaping of American nationhood in ways that, again, they include and they also exclude. So just to conclude, I mean, Agha's work really resonates with me because I think it captures well this ambiguity and this indeterminacy. And when you see this is not a refuge, take your time and soak it in. Think about the soft flowing lines that are projected from the sculpture, and also look at the hard, rigid edges. And I think that the contrast between those, it says a lot about what it means to be an American. That's it. Thank you so much.